Hello folks, welcome back. Today I want to talk about a kind of clock that a lot of people start out with, and that is a kitchen clock or parlor clock. You've seen clocks like this in antique stores, and they're a great place to start collecting because they're relatively inexpensive and they probably can be made to run. Now, a quick disclaimer, some of the clocks that you may run across are in need of service, and there are just things that are beyond the scope of this video that are wrong with them. And I'll address some of those more things in additional videos. But I wanted today to just get started looking at how to take care of a common clock that you might see and to see if you can get it running for your own enjoyment. Doing a brief walk around on the clock, we've got our outer case, our glass door, and the crown. In some of these clocks, the top pieces come off. This Seth Thomas Eclipse does not do that. It all is one piece. If we look to the side, we can see there is a catch for the door that catches on this hook. So I can lock the door closed with this catch, and then I can release it like so. Clocks like this were intended to be interacted with, so don't be afraid of getting in there and touching them. On the inside of this clock, just by opening the door, we can see here's our pendulum. There it goes. This clock actually has an alarm bell as well as the coil gong, which strikes. Quick point of terminology, clocks that make noise are divided into two categories, ones that strike and those that chime. A clock that strikes is one that simply counts the hour. A clock that chimes will sing you a song on sometimes the hour or even as much as every quarter hour. So this is a striking clock, and usually you can tell that by the quantity of winding arbors on the clock. Now this is not a hard and fast rule, but it's probably a 95% rule. And usually, again, not always, but usually the one on the right side of the dial is for winding the timekeeping movement, and the one on the left is for the striking movement. And a fun fact, if you would like your striking clock to not strike, if you only wind the timing arbor, as soon as this winds fully down, it will stop striking because that mechanism won't have any power, and you can actually enjoy your clock silently even if it was originally designed as a striking clock. So first things first, and that is understanding the pendulum. Anytime you move a clock like this, you want to remove the pendulum from the clock. They are very prone to breaking the glass, and they also can affect the operation of the clock in a negative way. So on this clock, it's very easy. We've got our pendulum leader right here, and the pendulum bob, which is this part, has a hook that attaches. There are a couple different styles of pendulum bobs, but for the most part, you should be able to figure out how to remove this. So again, wherever you purchase your clock from, they should remove the bob for you and wrap it up separately in some paper towels. If you move your own clock, make sure that the pendulum comes off absolutely 100% of the time. The next thing is winding the clock. So a clock with winding arbors like this needs a key, and these keys are available new. If your clock did not come with the key, there are several suppliers. One I use frequently is timesavers.com. They sell hundreds of keys. And these come in different sizes. They are a square hole, which lines up with the square arbor. Most Seth Thomas clocks are a number 6 to number 7. This is a key that has got a number 7 stamped in it. And there are a couple different scales, American versus German and whatnot. And if you're just getting started, it might be worth going to a clock shop to see if you can get a key that fits there. If you plan to own a few clocks, you can order an assortment of keys, or you can also measure it if you have a fine-grained ruler or a dial caliper or something. But I have this key number 7, which is going to fit. And so let's get right started and talk about how to wind the clock. Winding the clock, insert the key in the arbor, and then most movements turn inward. Most weak running movements require approximately 7 turns or 14 half turns to fully wind the clock. So a common question is, can you overwind the clock? Overwinding actually is a misnomer. It's not something that can be done. Clocks like this are intended to be wound fully. And by wound fully, what I mean is I'm using enough pressure to get it to move. This clock is almost totally run down. And I'm not forcing anything, and in a moment we'll see this all of a sudden get much harder to wind. There it is right there. And this is when you're done. There's usually a little bit of slop on the end where the last teeth of the ratchet doesn't quite get to the end of the spring, and that's totally fine. As long as you're not putting a cordless drill or something on this, it's unlikely that you can actually overwind this. Clocks that are described as having been overwound, that is an excuse for a clock not running. So I'm going to now go over to my strike side, and I can wind this up. It's okay if they sound a little different, the strike and the time side. Again, this should take approximately 14 half turns if it has been a week since you last ran it. Now, these clocks frequently run longer than 7 days if they're in good working order, and so it may take more than 14 turns to get it fully wound if it ran itself out. And there we are, we're fully wound again. So we can give our pendulum a little kick, and we'll see if it runs. I can hear it ticking. The next thing is setting the time on a clock like this. Any clock that has a striking or chiming mechanism, it's very important that you never force the movement when you run it backwards, and that as you're setting the time forward, you always let the sequence complete before you move the hand. For example, I'm going to set this clock to the 12, and we'll hear a click for the what's called the warning, and that's the striking mechanism getting ready to go. And then we should hear it count the hour. Okay, there we go. It struck. Careful observers will have noted that it actually struck 6 times, even though it says 8 o'clock. And that can be rectified a couple different ways. One of them is usually you can just move the hour hand. It's just a friction fit on the drum and point it at the hour that just chimed. Otherwise, you can reach in, and sometimes clocks have a little lever down here that allows you to advance the count wheel arm, and then you can trigger the chime to run manually. In this case, I'm going to just carefully put a little pressure on the hour hand, and I'm going to set it to 6, which matches the hour. This works on most kitchen clocks. Again, there are some exceptions, so this video is primarily geared toward a kitchen clock like this. I'll do other videos on other types of clocks and some things that are good to know. But there we are. There's our basic operation of setting the time and then winding the clock. A couple other things that are things that you'll have to commonly deal with is adjusting the time. If you want the clock to run faster, that is adjusted on clocks like this with the rating nut. If I spin this to the right as I'm facing the front of the bob, that will wind this nut up on the chain, shortening the length of the pendulum bob, which will speed up the clock. And if I go the other way, that will lower the nut and that will slow the clock down. Generally speaking, clocks like this can be made to run within about 1 to 2 minutes a week pretty easily. If they're in really great shape, you might be able to get it as close as maybe 10 or 15 seconds a week, though that will change with seasons. So as you get a clock, it may take you a while to get this adjusted. And my approach for sneaking up on the right timekeeping operation is to just let it run for a day and see, is it fast, is it slow, and then you make adjustments initially in terms of a full turn, and when you get it close, or if you overshoot, then maybe start making adjustments a half a turn at a time and then a quarter of a turn at a time. You're not going to get it perfect for a clock like this because these were never meant as super high precision clocks, but they can be made, almost any clock like this can be made to keep perfectly adequate time over the course of a week. And then when you wind the clock on whatever day you choose to do that, you can just set it. For a clock to run well, it must be in beat. And essentially what that means is the sound of the tick and the tock are even. This clock is not doing too badly. I have my timing machine set up in balance mode here. What these numbers mean is with the negative, that means that one side of the time was shorter than the other side, which would indicate that the clock is either out of level or the movement needs a little bit of adjustment. It sounds not too bad. If you've got a careful ear, you can hear that the ticks and the tocks are not quite perfect, but it's in the range. But let me demonstrate what happens if I stick a shim under one side of the clock, and you'll hear the clock's operation change. I've shimmed up this side of the clock, so now the case is not level. And you can see that reflected on the tester. These numbers are bigger both in the positive and the negative direction. A clock that's perfectly in beat would be very close to 0, plus and minus on this. A good frame of reference is if you can get it within maybe plus or minus 30 on a tester like this, the clock should run just fine. We are at about minus 130 to plus 130, and so this clock has actually got a lot of overswing, so it's still reasonably happy here, but it's not quite right. And if I stop talking, you can hear what that sounds like. So how do we fix this? The easiest way is to make your clock be level. If the clock is in good service, that should be all you need. I'm going to carefully remove my shim here. Clock is going to settle back down, and we can see our timer still isn't maybe quite perfect, but it's a lot better, and a clock at this level of being out of beat is probably close enough. One of the things that does happen fairly often, and that is if the clock sounds out of beat even though it is level, this is where we have to make an adjustment to the pendulum crutch so that this can run well. And to show you that better, I'm going to take the hands and the dial off. Removing the hands and the dial isn't too terribly hard, but if you're not comfortable with it, there are many clock repair people that would be able to help you with this. The tools you need typically would be a pliers of some kind and a screwdriver. I'm going to use a pair of needle nose pliers for this. And what's in the center of the arbor here is something called a taper pin. And a taper pin is just that. It's a pin that is thicker on one end and thinner on the other. You can see there's a square hole here, and this brass washer is behind that. And so I'm going to take my pliers, and I'm going to carefully find the side of that which is the thin side, putting my pliers on the opposite side of the nut, and the thin side I should be able to loosen the taper pin. So there's our taper pin. And I want to keep track of the order that these parts were assembled. Using your digital camera and your phone or another camera to take pictures as you go will help you get this back in the right order. So we've got our taper pin, we've got our brass washer, and on this clock, that's it. We have our minute hand. Now I'm going to keep track of where this is pointing. I'm in the first quarter of the hour here. So I'm going to pull this off. And then here we have our press fit hour hand. And so this can be removed just by pulling on it. That friction comes from this collar that rides on the outer barrel here. Removing the dial, I switch over to my screwdriver, and I'm going to, in this case, this clock only has 2 screws. So I'm going to hold on to the dial as I remove these, and once I loosen this, I can get it with my fingers. And I go to the other side here. And we're in. So this is a lyre-shaped movement. You can see the movement plates here. This is a clock that I have not done any work to, and we can see the discoloration. This clock does need service, and I'll get to that at some point. But I wanted to point out a couple things as we're in here. And the first is what we were talking about, and that is setting the clock in beat or not. And the other is the other way to synchronize chimes using the count wheel lever. So the pendulum is this silver rod here that attaches to the bob, and that is hung from what's called the suspension spring, and this is a flat piece of metal that is a spring, and it actually bends. This is much lower friction than some kind of a rolling pivot on that, which is why it's done. But how the movement actually connects to the pendulum is through this pendulum connector, which is the crutch. Up here we have the verge. This is the escape wheel. And off of the verge is the crutch, which connects to the pendulum rod by this little hook. To set the clock in beat, what I need to do is I need to change the relationship of the verge up there with the position of the pendulum. And again, I only want to do this after the clock is level. And again, you only want to do this if you are comfortable getting into the clock this far. Otherwise, again, I would encourage you to seek help from a clock repair person. But this wire right here is brass, and it's reasonably flexible. And by doing a slight bend to this wire and you want to do that by putting a couple points on it, you can actually change the relationship one way or the other to make it run in beat. And so if you make a slight adjustment and it sounds better, you know you went in the right direction. If it either doesn't run at all, or if it got worse, you know you went either the wrong direction or too far, and to solve that, you need to bend it the other way. You may remember me pointing out that the right arbor was to wind the time side and the left to wind the strike side. And that corresponds with most of the gears in each system. These are the main time train gears. These are the strike train gears. There are a couple different kinds of striking clocks. This one is called a count wheel. The other kind is a snail cam, and we'll do a video sometime on how those operate. Those are actually in many ways preferable to count wheels because they don't get unsynchronized with the hands where a count wheel clock can. But while we're here, let's look at what the count wheel mechanism looks like. Count wheel mechanism is named after this wheel right here, which is the count wheel. The count wheel has a series of deep teeth with shallow teeth in between, and if you look carefully, you can see that the number of teeth around the wheel is not uniform. In this section right at the top of the wheel, we see 6 or so teeth, and then one section over here is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. And that is how the clock knows to regulate the number of strikes. I can operate this manually by lifting this lever. So there was 8 strikes. I was a little off there. And you can see the lever went into one of those deep teeth which arrested the striking movement. So if I'm way off, I can, if I have access to this lever, and actually some repair people will sometimes attach a little rod to this lever and it would hang down through the movement so you could access it without disassembling the clock. You can run this manually without damaging the clock to set the right strike. So there we have it. Those are the two things that you may need to disassemble the clock to adjust, either the beat of the clock by adjusting the pendulum crutch, and again, very small changes and being gentle are the way to go, and then also synchronizing the chime with the hands. With the dial attached, we can turn the hands. You always want to start with the hour hand, and you want to point it at the chime that last struck. So for example, 10 o'clock, I'm going to point this somewhere after the 10, and I can put a little friction in here to see it. And then I'm going to use my minute hand to figure out where the clock is. Now this clock strikes both on the hour and the half hour, and so we'll see what happens with that. Okay, that must be the half hour strike because this clock does not do anything at the 15 or the 45. So that means that I can point my minute hand at the 6. And then if I'm not that fussy, I can probably just give a little tension on my hour hand and get it close enough. If I want to be really sure that I've got that pointed the right way, I can wind my minute hand forward up to the hour. There's our warn. There we go. We got 11 chimes and our hands are pointing at 11 o'clock. So I'm going to give that a little adjustment. I'm going to put our brass tension washer on. And then I'm going to put our taper pin back in. I'm inserting the thinner side, and I'm going to use my pliers to give just a little bit of tension on that. I want to be careful to not scratch anything with my pliers. But there we go. Now we're back together. Now that our hands are back on, we can set the clock to the actual time. The very critical piece is we always must be patient to let the clock finish its last strike cycle before we move the hand farther. So right now the clock says about 1:02, and let's say it's 3:27. That's our target time. I'm going to gently push the minute hand forward. There's our half-hour strike. There's our warn. I'm going to let that completely finish, striking the next hour. Half hour again. Moving slow, letting everything finish. There's our warn. Even letting the warn finish before you move it on is important. All right, there's our 3. And we have 20, 25, 26, 27. And there's our target time. You can, in some cases, if you overshoot just by a minute or so, move the minute hand backwards. It depends on where the striking mechanism is at that particular time. In a typical kitchen clock, those danger zones are when the minute hand is somewhere in the top, sort of 10 to 2, and then the bottom, sort of the same thing. The basic rule is if you feel any resistance, don't do it. Just stop. A great way to stop a clock to let a couple minutes go by is you can just arrest the pendulum bob, wait a couple minutes, come back later. It's always easy to set a clock forward. Setting a clock backward is a little bit dangerous. You need to know how your clock operates and to know when you can push the minute hand back and how far and when you can't. But again, the basic rule of thumb is don't force anything. If it feels like it's resisting you, just stop. We've talked through the basics of a clock like this and shown you the main ways that you would interact with a clock. One thing I did want to mention is a clock like this is a machine much like your car, and they do need service. Chances are, if you purchase a clock that you don't know the history of, your clock is in need of service, and I would recommend having that done because the clock will wear out much more quickly if it's dirty than if it's clean. There are a number of repair people around that can help you with that. And it's something that you can actually learn yourself if you are somewhat mechanically inclined. There are some resources online, and certainly you can look at the other videos on this channel. There we have our gong going out. So appreciate your time watching this video. I hope it was helpful.